Mrs. Flick, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation. There is something which has been on my mind for quite some time, and I must be cautious because I was introduced as an economic scientist. This means I think about the past. But I can say make one forecast, and I will make only this one about the future. Meaning the euro issue will be with us for quite some time, and we certainly haven't found a solution. This is the only forecast I would like to make. If there are any other predictions, then I would like to ask you to wave at me. And, well, ladies and gentlemen, who is, say, superior sovereign in Euroland? Can you control the euro? Where does it come from? Where does it go to? Has anyone some power about this construct, about this currency? Will the euro sooner or later break apart? Because nobody's got the power to keep it together, or the other way around, that we can't get rid of the euro anymore because nobody's got the power to break it up. So these are some of the questions which people ask themselves today. I cannot answer these questions, but nevertheless, I would like to present some theses or propositions. One, the euro which we see today is not the euro for which the decision was made, but this euro has changed over time, sometimes substantially so. This also includes that the, say, nature of those playing a part has changed too. The politicians, the institutions, they have done things with the euro within the eurozone or against the euro and outside the eurozone. I don't think it is a secret to tell you that the financial crisis in 2007 was some kind of catalyst at the time. And this means we have seen new processes, and this really brings me to the topic of my presentation. In our Euro constitution, which I'm going to describe in a minute, we didn't have one thing. We didn't have any provisions for a major shock which the system has to sustain, but we experienced such a shock during the financial crisis. Today, I try to think together with you to think how we can, or what we can think of the euro since its development starting in 2007. We do not see any signs for a return to a normal situation, a euro situation. We do not know whether there will be such a normal situation at all. You can only speculate about this kind of idea. The question, why do we have the euro, and why are there any, say, reasonable or sensible historical examples? You know, you have to become aware of or you are probably aware of the fact that the euro is a discrete phenomenon, and it might be compared to the wood standard at the end of the 19th century. So here we had an agreement on one value standard, i.e. gold. This system meant that the participating countries, in order to enter this system and stay within this system, had to adjust their financial policies strictly. And during the gold standard, an ongoing austerity policy had to be pursued. At the same time, there are interesting, hints at differences. It starts with the fact that the gold standard meant to exclude the weakest, so the Grexit, which was feared, was a normal situation at the time. And we also see that the gold standard has worked in a kind of strange way that is coordinated by the central bank of a specific country, in this case, the central bank of the UK. Not all countries had a central bank. America is a case in point, interesting for a historian, because the dollar has to be excluded from our ideas about standards in this respect, at least before World War I. When the euro was developed, a different approach was used, and of course there were routes and ways which, at the end of the day, caused problems. In comparison with the gold standard, this was a system alive and kicking, and before it spread, the gold standard was a fair weather plane. That is, whenever people had big shocks, crises, etc., there was a run on the gold reserves, also the reserves of the Bank of England. And not following any, say, fiscal or financial doctrine, the obligation to convert the gold was discontinued, so paper money was used. But at the end of such a crisis, people always collected these additional funds and returned to the old parities. So this is a typical approach not only of English fiscal policy, but within the worldwide system which the gold standard represented. So here things like wars or natural catastrophes were taken into account. They were exceptions to the normal way of handling things. These shocks meant that everything can be done in times of an emergency. And of course, the result was that government or sovereign debt was possible, that money supply was expanded across the gold standard, beyond the gold standard. But this exceptional situation will come to an end, and then we will return to the rule, very painfully so. And, England probably sustained, most injuries in this case. I'm talking about the United Kingdom after the Napoleonic Wars, and a sovereign or a debt ratio of about 300%. So at the time, so Greece is really peanuts in this respect. And I can say that UK as a world power in the 19th century cannot really be compared to today's Greece. So strict austerity policy, which had social consequences. This is what Charles Dickens, for instance, described in his books, and a social scientist from Elberfeld who went over there and had a closer look at the working class, Friedrich Engels. So here you see the consequences, or in their books you find a description of the consequences of their policy. The state ratio was reduced down to 30% just ahead of just before the First World War. So at this time, it really worked. Now, euro, here people used another path. We had a supranational institution as a central bank, so we did not use the central bank of one core country, probably at the time the Bundesbank, and this was something which people didn't want to follow with far-reaching consequences. And also national currencies were also abolished, and this is where the comparison with the gold standard stopped. The euro is the only legal tender in these member countries. No, people did not think about certain aspects like our economics minister had to learn sooner. Recently. Is it a stronger or is it a weaker currency? When it is stronger, it is more than a paper currency. And of course, there are massive exit barriers. You cannot simply leave the system. And of course, it is not possible to push someone out of the system. All right, now this was the euro regime, and in order to have it work, these so-called convergence criteria were introduced, and the 60% debt ratio, the deficit criteria, 3%, and these criteria had to be fulfilled in order to be accepted and admitted to this club of nations. So by doing so, a corset was created for behaving well, so that you cannot exclude someone and you cannot throw somebody out. If you cannot do that, then, well, what will be the situation? It may mean that the weakest member of such a group of nations will just try to, get rid of its debts at the expense of the others. The Maastricht Treaty then came on stage, and the euro was not that negatively, say, constructed, but it was all about the fiscal systems being able to handle or go through burdens. But the euro was not developed with a financial crisis of 2007 in mind, because the Maastricht criteria really were, say, nullified even, and this state debt rate or similar things suddenly couldn't be used. So as I said, the euro at the time was a fair weather plane, so not everything was all right. But the euro is still around, and I believe this is good. This means we can see that following the financial crisis, two major approaches were initiated to save the euro. One, an attempt of the German finance minister to intervene during the first Greek debt crisis in 2010. I would call it Schäuble Euro 1. Now, this was a double strategy people followed at the time. It means the participating weak country is to be helped out using this bailout, and that you have, the redemption amounts or the interest rates of the interest paid into an account, and then following along this route. Now, here or at the present time, we try to work out a combination of bailout and austerity policy. So this is what we try to do now. Now, the banking system, and one motive after the financial crisis was that you did not really want to adjust the value of debts, and that people started to speculate that this is, say, a kind of exception. And now I would like to say defend Schäuble Euro 1. If in 2012 the crisis would have been over, or had been over, and Greece also had been saved, then this would have been a footnote in the history. Whether or not this really would have happened, well, this is something to think about. The fact is, Greece is a small country. Now, using a bailout and taking over debts, etc., it was not possible to eliminate the problem, but at least you can postpone its final solution. But suddenly, it was no longer possible to have the risk premiums on government bonds to be increased, and this was something which didn't work out. What we saw was that the countries really entered a debt crisis which were too big to bear, simply too large, so that simply using the coffers of, say, the of Germany couldn't help out. Now, bailout and the violation of the Maastricht criteria, this was something which was not envisaged, and the next step was also not envisaged. That is the announcement of an open market policy by the ECB. Open market policy means that the bank will intervene in markets, particularly in markets of government bonds, saying if the revenue and the interests on these securities will rise, then we are going to support this government. But this is a well-tested system which we've known since the 30s. But at the time the ECB just announced it, didn't really put it into practice. The effect was very quickly that the risk premiums really collapsed. Now, what we see in front of us now is something very exciting, because the ECB really moved, almost on the verge of violating their own rules, and this led to legal proceedings. The question is whether they really follow the policy of supporting, supporting a country which is not permitted according to their rules. And I can only say that the ECB ECB was not forbidden, and this is an interesting aspect. The ECB was not forbidden to follow this route. And it is interesting to see that the ECB used an instrument which was not envisaged, which was not planned, and the legitimacy of it is still doubted, at least in Germany, suddenly played to be the master of, say, sovereignties. And, you know, Carl Schmitt, in the time between the two wars, that there will be a person who can, you know, decide on announcing a state of emergency. During the Euro crisis, we had two fighting parties. Here, the German financial minister, and the second, when the crisis also affected the countries in Southern Europe, then the ECB announced its own tea policy, and this means it was the only institution which was able to respond to such crises within even nanoseconds. So they became the kind of autocrat in this respect. So with this, or looking at this euro, we enter a phase of amending constitutions which has affected the constitutions of the countries affected. The German Financial Ministry, in its policy, since the introduction of the euro, has changed its policies, and one of the steps was mentioned before. There was one new step, that is the conscious assumption and introduction of a policy of non-government debt, by no means under normal conditions. So at the same time, the position of the ECB has also changed. If the Weigel euro tried to, when the then finance minister tried to see the ECB as the, say, arm of the Bundesbank. So you might say the ECB as a copy of the Bank of England, playing the first violin in this concert. You know, when looking at this crisis, or against the backdrop of this crisis, you will understand that the ECB and its policies have changed. And we can also mention Le Pen, for instance. The nature of this change is not only an ECB influenced by a soft or affected by a soft inflation. I believe the ECB has taken one political step from taken over steps from the Federal Reserve in the United States and the Bank of England. And, you know, since then, the ECB is no longer an arm of the Bundesbank, but it is an arm of the Fed. The central banker of the Bundesbank have no influence, or not so much influence any longer, but it is now all about MIT economics. And of course, they use different approaches. But we can also see that the ECB didn't maintain its sovereignty or its superiority in times of this crisis. Her hands were tied, and she is not the master of the Greek debt crisis, because the means or the instrument of open market policy cannot be used for Greece, because Greece will not have access to capital markets in times of crisis. If now the ECB had started to conduct open market policy for Greece, then I'm sure that things would have turned out much worse. Actually, the ball was kicked back to the field of the German finance minister. And this means this is the second edition of the Schäuble Euro 1. Now let us take a step back. Do not ask ourselves which euro is good. Do we prefer Schäuble? Do we prefer Draghi? Or do we prefer the German mark maybe? Now, let's simply ask ourselves, in these times of exceptions which was not envisaged in the Maastricht Treaty, the crises and the wars haven't been envisaged during times of the gold standard. Now, who is the sovereign in this case? And we see that in the Schäuble euro, we have a new edition of the old system. That is, we want to go back to the club of the best. We want to return to a system where austerity policy is combined with bailouts, and it is certainly no wonder that many people of the second edition of the Schäuble euro were not convinced, because there's a problem. And the problem is that the system has got credibility problems, and my timer just tells me that I should stop in a minute, and I will come to an end soon. You see, if you think it through, then the Schäuble euro system is not or will help and continue to help a weak country like Greece. So we will go from one, say, bailout to another. This is an unregulated system of financial balances. Mr. Fuchs said that he received interesting emails when he pointed or when he indicated these points, and I can say that during a TV interview, I mentioned this financial bailout, and I received lots and lots of respective emails. It's not about whether I want it. The only thing that I do is I talk about this financial bailout, and if nothing changes, then it's just about naming this baby. Do we want to have it an official baby in the Eurozone that is being one step on the route to developing or compiling a kind of financial or economical constitution? Or shall we try to urge Greece to move in this or that direction like a Don Quixote?
I come to the end of my presentation. Who's got the power in Euroland? The Draghi euro, which we've seen, gives all power to the ECB. This has an interesting consequence because the ECB is a European institution. And we have seen, as a consequence of this Draghi euro, is that it accumulated more and more competencies with a view to banking supervision. Banking supervision with the European Central Bank is devil's work. You can say a lot of bad things about it. The fact is that an institution whose objectives are very likely not the objectives of the German Bundesbank has accumulated a lot of authority in this respect. In polemic terms, I may say that it resembles the banks of Spain and Italy more than the Bundesbank. What does that mean? It means the monetary policy has replaced fiscal policy, is a short-term substitute, and we do not know whether such a Draghi euro would not lead to a medium-term disappearance of the borders between fiscal and monetary policies. Let us imagine a pessimistic scenario, a scenario which was whispered into my ear during the break, a scenario in which the various parts of the Eurozone drift apart further and further, and this refers to the economic output per capita. Then you can imagine that a Draghi euro will certainly offer us southern European currency environments, which I know from childhood. Whenever we went to Italy, the prices have gone up considerably. And of course, this means that as a boy, I learned very quickly to handle large figures. An interesting form of teaching arithmetics. We can also ask, in other words, whether the Schäuble euro is a good thing, whether it really reflects the power of the German finance ministry, which was reported on in the international press, or whether or not it just reflects the powerlessness of this ministry. Or in other words, you might also say, if we think through Mr. Schäuble's idea, then we might conclude that we push Greece into a Grexit very soon, or that we push Greece and other countries to a Grexit inevitably if there is no reduction of their debt, and if there are no reforms which would make these countries more similar to us in terms of microeconomics, then a Mediterranean mass Grexit cannot be avoided. And this also means that we would return to a Deutschmark zone, in this case probably without France. That is, the border of this Deutschmark zone would just pass Mr. Schäuble's constituency. An interesting perspective, I believe, and we can then ask ourselves only whether it might be better if this Brexit does not occur. There was a Financial Times article recently saying that the negotiations with Greek have been a serious defeat for Mr. Schäuble because the Grexit didn't happen, and there are good reasons that the Grexit is the only economically viable solution. This need not be, but of course there are other things which we can think of. But what happens if the Grexit does not occur? This means we live in Euroland with a euro which will survive longer than we thought, which is softer than we wanted it to be, and within which a financial compensation among the weak and strong countries becomes eternal, if you like, and that at the end of the day we will have a financial and fiscal institution in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.